Beneath the streets of Cincinnati, Ohio, there are 2.5 miles of finished subway tunnel. Platforms, staircases, ventilation shafts, all of it built, all of it structurally sound, all of it still down there right now. Not one train has ever run through it. Not once. Not for a single day in over 100 years. The city spent the equivalent of well over 100 million of today's dollars building it. Voters approved it by a landslide. And then it simply stopped, and almost nobody alive today, including some of the people directly responsible, can fully explain why. Here's exactly what I'm going to show you in the next half hour. The real 1916 vote where 80% of Cincinnati said yes to this subway. The corrupt political machine that controlled the city before construction even started. The literal cracks that appeared in people's homes as the tunneling went on. And the one detail that I think is the most human part of this entire story. The reform mayor who killed the project. And what he said about it when someone finally asked him, 60 years later, what actually happened. This isn't a mystery with a hidden answer. It's a story that was hiding in plain sight, in plain documents, the whole time. A city built around a ditch. To understand why Cincinnati ever wanted a subway, you first have to understand the canal that ran straight through the middle of it. The Miami and Erie Canal was completed in 1827, and for a few decades it made Cincinnati genuinely rich, a direct water link from the Great Lakes down to the Ohio River and onward to the Mississippi. But canals lose to railroads almost everywhere in America during the second half of the 19th century, and Cincinnati's canal was no exception. By the 1850s, it was already losing money. By the time we get to the later 1800s, it had become something much less romantic than a trade route. It was, by multiple contemporary accounts, an open sewer, a stagnant, mosquito-breeding, garbage-clogged ditch running right through the heart of downtown. In September 1883, a weekly Cincinnati magazine called The Graphic published a striking illustration, trains running underground. Directly inside the old canal bed, with a wide modern boulevard built on top. It was, as far as anyone can tell, the first time anyone in Cincinnati put the idea on paper. Drain the eyesore, build a subway in the empty trench, put a beautiful street on top of that. It's a genuinely elegant idea, and it sat there, mostly unrealized, for almost 30 years. While Cincinnati kept growing into one of the 7 largest cities in the entire United States, genuinely comparable, at the time, to New York or Chicago in size and economic importance. A city that size, with traffic getting worse every year on streets never designed for the volume, eventually needed a real answer. So 30 years after that magazine illustration, Cincinnati finally got serious. And the way they got serious tells you almost everything you need to know about how this story is going to end. The plan and the price in March 1912, a 3-person board of rapid transit commissioners, was appointed to figure out, once and for all, how to fix Cincinnati's transportation problem. They brought in a planner from Chicago who came back with 6 different possible routes. The plan that won was ambitious, a 16-mile rapid transit loop circling the entire city, including a downtown subway section built directly inside the drained canal bed, exactly as that 1883 magazine had imagined surfacing above ground through the Mill Creek Valley, looping east through the industrial neighborhoods of Norwood, and eventually running back downtown along an elevated railway by the river. The original estimate was $12 million. To make it politically palatable, the board trimmed it down to $6 million, still an enormous sum for a single American city to borrow in 1916. On the day of the vote, more than 80% of Cincinnati's voters said yes. Not a narrow win, a landslide. This wasn't a project forced on an unwilling public. The people of Cincinnati wanted this, clearly and overwhelmingly. And then, almost immediately, the largest war in human history up to that point got in the way. Until after the war, this part is documented directly in the Cincinnati Enquirer's own pages. On April 5, 1918, the paper reported that, quote, "War conditions have prompted the opinion in certain official quarters that it would be unwise to proceed with the construction of the loop until after the war. High costs of materials and the difficulty of getting deliveries were cited as the specific reasons for the delay. That's not speculation about hidden motives. That's a newspaper at the time plainly stating the obvious. World War I was eating up materials, labour and money that a subway project simply couldn't compete for. When the war ended in November 1918, the relief didn't last. Wartime inflation had already done its damage. By 1919, what had been a $12 million plan trimmed to $6 million for the public vote, now genuinely needed closer to $13 million to actually finish more than double what voters had approved. Despite that, the city pushed forward anyway, choosing to begin construction with the money they had and figure out the rest later. Ground was broken on January 28, 1920, at the intersection of Walnut Street and what is now Central Parkway. The easy part that wasn't the subway section, built inside the old drained canal bed, was supposed to be the simple part of the project. You weren't tunneling through bedrock. You were essentially lining a trench that already existed. As one historical account of the project put it afterward, with some understatement, easier said than done. By early 1921, the inflation everyone had worried about hit in full force. The money available could now only complete 11 of the original 16 miles. The entire eastern section of the loop from the Oakley neighbourhood back into downtown had to be cut from the plan entirely before a single additional mile of track had been laid beyond what was already underway. And then came a problem nobody had budgeted for at all. As crews blasted and excavated through the Brighton neighbourhood, residents living above and alongside the construction began reporting real, physical damage to their homes, cracks in foundations, structural concerns serious enough that the construction methods themselves drew suspicion from state examiners reviewing the project. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's such an ordinary, human kind of problem to derail something this ambitious. Not sabotage, not a hidden conspiracy. Just the genuinely difficult, messy, physical reality of blasting tunnels under a residential neighbourhood with 1920s equipment, and the very predictable lawsuits and property damage claims that followed. Remember that dark tunnel I opened this video with? By 1923, 2 miles of it, including stations, platforms, everything were actually finished. Built, done, ready, structurally, for trains. So what happened next is, I think, the part of this story almost nobody tells correctly. Cincinnati's real problem wasn't engineering to understand what actually killed the Cincinnati subway. You need to understand the city's politics in the 1910s and 1920s, because this is genuinely where the story turns, and it has almost nothing to do with tunnels. For decades, Cincinnati had been run by a political machine first built by a man named George Cox, and after Cox's decline, controlled by his successor, Rudolph Hinecker. The journalist Lincoln Steffens, writing at the height of the American muckraking era, called Cincinnati one of the 2 worst governed cities in the entire United States. Even William Howard Taft, then Secretary of War and later President, gave a speech in 1905 specifically attacking the corruption under Cox's control of the city. By the early 1920s, the consequences of that corruption were concrete and ugly. The city was nearly bankrupt. There were real threats to close a hospital that treated tuberculosis patients because the city couldn't afford to keep it running. Citizens reportedly had to tip garbage collectors directly just to ensure their trash actually got picked up. Interest earned on the city's own public bank accounts was being quietly funneled into the machine's pockets instead of the public treasury. This was the actual operating environment the subway project was being built inside, not a clean, well-run city making a single bad engineering decision, but a deeply corrupt one where basic municipal services were already failing. The man who built his career on stopping corruption, Murray Seasongood, was a Harvard-educated Cincinnati lawyer who, in October 1923, gave a speech to a civic group called the Cincinnati Association, attacking a proposed special tax levy backed by Hineker's machine. The speech became known, somewhat theatrically, as the shot heard round the wards, and it worked. Seasongood, almost single-handedly defeated that tax levy at the ballot box by a margin of roughly 60,000 votes to 46,000. Energized by that win, Seasongood went after the machine itself. In 1924, he helped draft an entirely new city charter, replacing the unwieldy 32-member city council with a streamlined 9-member body, introducing a professional. Council appointed city manager to handle day-to-day administration and switching to non-partisan at large elections specifically designed to break the machine's stranglehold on individual wards. The new charter passed in 1924. In the November 1925 council elections, Seasongood's Reform Party, called fittingly the Charter Party, won 6 of the new council's 9 seats, a result that reportedly stunned even Seasongood's own side. His fellow council members elected him as the very first mayor under the new system. This is, by any reasonable measure, a genuine and admirable political achievement, an honest reformer using legitimate democratic means, successfully dismantling a documented corrupt machine that had been strangling a major American city for decades. And it is also, almost as a direct side effect, the thing that ended the subway. Here's the part that I think makes this story genuinely interesting instead of just sad. Seasongood wasn't against the subway. By most accounts, he actually wanted it finished. But the tools he used to fix Cincinnati's corruption were the exact same tools that ended up killing the project he was hoping to save. How reform accidentally became the final blow as mayor, Seasongood believed and said publicly that the subway needed far more careful study and planning than it had ever received under the old corrupt Rapid Transit Board, which had operated under county rather than city control, a structural arrangement Seasongood and the other reformers found deeply unsatisfying as they worked to consolidate. Honest, accountable city governance. In 1926, as mayor, Seasongood wrote the city's new charter in a way that swept away the old Republican machine-aligned structures still lingering in city government. By 1929, his administration had formally dissolved the original Rapid Transit Commission, the very body that had overseen construction from the beginning, and brought what remained of the subway project directly under his own office's control. In its final report, the outgoing Rapid Transit Commission blamed inflation for essentially all of the project's problems, and told the city that completing the line as originally planned would now require an additional $9 to $10 million beyond what had already been spent. Then, in October 1929, the stock market crashed. Whatever slim chance remained of finding that additional funding evaporated overnight, and the country descended into the Great Depression. Central Parkway, the wide, beautiful boulevard, built directly on top of the unused tunnels, exactly as that 1883 magazine illustration had first imagined, officially open to traffic on October 1st, 1928, with a full week of public celebration. Cincinnatians drove and walked along a brand new boulevard, almost certainly without most of them fully grasping that an entire, mostly finished subway sat directly beneath their feet, already effectively abandoned. Cincinnati's white elephant through the 1930s, as automobile ownership kept climbing and the case for an expensive rapid transit system kept weakening in the public's eyes, critics increasingly took to calling the unfinished project Cincinnati's white elephant an expensive, useless thing nobody quite knew what to do with. Proposal after proposal surfaced and then quietly died. In 1939, the University of Cincinnati's College of Engineering studied converting a section of tunnel into a wind tunnel for aerodynamic research. The idea went nowhere. That same year, city manager CO, Sherrill proposed converting the tunnels for automobile traffic instead of rail, but the conversion cost was judged too high to justify. Then, in 1941, the United States entered World War II, and like almost every ambitious civic project in the country, the subway question simply got shelved for the duration. There's a genuinely interesting, much smaller footnote here. The tunnels were repurposed during the war as potential air raid shelters, and surviving photographs of the abandoned tunnels today still show old bunk beds left behind from that brief wartime use a strange accidental museum exhibit nobody designed on purpose. The studies that kept saying no after the war, in 1948. The city commissioned yet another formal study into what to do with the unused tunnels. The conclusion was blunt, given how much Cincinnati's transportation needs and the surrounding city had changed over the preceding 2 decades. The report recommended that the subway project, in its original form, should be forgotten. That 1948 study effectively closed the book on the original vision. But the tunnels themselves never went away, and proposals to do something with them kept surfacing every decade or so for the rest of the century. A massive underground wine cellar, a nightlife and shopping district. Yet another attempt at modern rapid transit. None of them were ever built. In 1972, construction of Interstate 75 sliced directly through a significant portion of the original tunnel route, permanently destroying that section and reducing what remained to the roughly 2-mile stretch that still exists beneath the city today. And now I want to bring this back to Murray Seasongood himself, because there's one more piece of this story that I think says more about how history actually gets forgotten than almost anything else in this episode. An interview. Decades later, Murray Seasongood lived an extraordinarily long life. He died in 1983 at the age of 104. At some point in the 1960s, when he was already in his 80s, a college student from the University of Cincinnati interviewed him for a research project and asked him directly whether he regretted his role in the subway's failure. According to that interviewer's own later account, Seasongood was, quote, very jovial, very enthusiastic discussing his career in general. But when it came to the actual details of the subway system, the project his own administration had been most directly responsible for ending, he, quote, could not recall them. Think about what that actually means. The man whose anti-corruption reforms structurally guaranteed the subway's final collapse sat across from a student decades later and genuinely couldn't reconstruct the specifics of his own role in one of the largest infrastructure failures in his city's history. This isn't a cover-up. There's no evidence anyone was hiding anything from that student. It's something quieter and, I think, more universally true. Even the people who make consequential decisions don't always remember the full weight of those decisions once enough time has passed. History doesn't require a villain to become forgotten. It just requires enough years. What actually killed the Cincinnati subway? So let's answer the question plainly. Because by now we have all the real pieces in front of us. World War I delayed the start and doubled the cost through inflation before a single tunnel was dug. A genuinely corrupt political machine had already left the city financially weakened before construction even began. Blasting damage to a residential neighborhood created real, documented legal and engineering problems mid-construction. A sincere, well-intentioned reform movement restructured city government in ways that, as an unintended side effect, dissolved the very commission overseeing the project. And then, with brutal timing, the stock market crashed in 1929, permanently removing any realistic path to the additional funding the project needed. No single villain, no hidden discovery, no buried older city underneath. Just 5 entirely ordinary, well-documented historical forces arriving in almost the worst possible sequence on top of a project that needed everything to go right and got almost nothing. That tunnel I opened this video with is still down there right now, underneath Central Parkway, underneath thousands of Cincinnatians who drive over it every single day without thinking about it. It's not a secret. It's not hidden from the historical record. The city's own transportation department publishes the full history on its own website. University researchers have written entire books about it. The story was never suppressed. It was simply complicated enough and embarrassing enough that it stopped being worth retelling, until eventually almost nobody outside Cincinnati knew it existed at all. That's worth remembering the next time you see a video promising a hidden, suppressed, impossible to explain mystery underneath some American city. Sometimes the real explanation is sitting in a transportation department archive, a 1918 newspaper clipping, and an interview with an elderly reformer who simply couldn't remember the details anymore. The most honest kind of buried history isn't the kind someone hid on purpose. It's the kind that just got too complicated and too unglamorous for anyone to keep telling. If your city has an abandoned subway and unfinished transit tunnel, or some half-built piece of infrastructure that never got used the way it was supposed to, I want to hear about it in the comments. I'm building a running list, and several of you have already pointed me towards some genuinely fascinating ones after past episodes. If this kind of real, document-backed history is what you come to this channel for, the best thing you can do is share this with someone who'd appreciate knowing the actual, unglamorous, entirely human reasons history sometimes just stops in the middle. This has been the Vertical Archive. I'll see you in the next one.